Good morning, afternoon, or night, depending on where you're watching this. My name is Eric Fleming, and this is my point presentation from an informative perspective on man-in-the-middle attacks. Throughout the literature, this is abbreviated to save some space, as you can see below, although the other variants of this attack might change the last letter of the abbreviation, but if you see MIT, you can assume that that means man in the middle. So let's jump right on into this talk. First, I'm going to go over the definition and the consequences of a man-in-the-middle attack. Then we'll talk about how the attack is performed, followed by how you might detect this attack as a client. And finally, we'll draw some conclusions and takeaways. Man-in-the-middle is a type of attack in which a third party in stealth takes control of the communication channel between two or more parties. The attacker can intercept, modify, change, or replace a target's communication. Usually this is carried out over public Wi-Fi, although in the literature it doesn't always specify Wi-Fi. It could just be any subnet, but connecting your device through LAN tends to be harder to do, so public Wi-Fi is where most of these attacks take place. Now, man-in-the-middle attack can take two flavors. If you're just monitoring and logging the information, this is known as a passive attack, so essentially you're harvesting all this info and you'll decide what to do with it later. However, if you're actually going to go through and modify the communication, that is known as an active attack. Some of the consequences associated with man-in-the-middle attack. Well, if someone is eavesdropping on your communications, it's likely understood that they're looking for some sensitive information. Normal culprits are with online banking. Your routing number might be exposed, and therefore some transactions can be conducted without your validation. Or in other words, you're purchasing something online and your credit card information is exposed. We tend to multitask a lot, so you could be logging into multiple services, whether it's a social network or some news or maybe even a work portal. So your usernames, passwords, and or session tokens could be stolen through a man-in-the-middle attack. And the most aggressive, I would say, attack would actually involve installing malware, aka keylogging software on your device. So the attack isn't just what you're doing on the internet. The attack could involve anything that you're doing on your desktop. So that would be this would be the worst case scenario. It is worth noting that HTTPS has made it much harder to gain sensitive information. So most of the simple attacks occur through HTTP. However, this has just shifted what attackers are trying to exploit. So in other words, they're trying to perform the attack before a TLS connection is happening. So they're trying to preempt the HTTPS, and we'll see that. Now there's two main avenues that a man-in-the-middle attack could take place. The first is ARP spoofing. The second is SSL, aka TLS stripping. And that really aggressive man-in-the-middle attack I was talking about earlier, that's going to be perpetrated mostly through DNS spoofing. Although it is worth noting that the ARP spoof is the critical ingredient in all of these. They're pretty much, it's going to happen in all of the forms. So let's talk about ARP spoofing. So ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol. Your computer is going to store a map of IP addresses and MAC addresses so that when you reach out to the internet, it's going to know, hey, where's the gateway and where's the router, because that thing is going to forward my IP requests on outwards, and it needs to know my IP address so that it can forward back the responses to me. Now this protocol was invented before Wi-Fi, where most networks were secured. You had to physically jack into it, and there weren't that many ports. And if there was a malicious attacker, it was being perpetrated by someone in your organization itself, and that's a whole other separate issue. So this protocol is unsafe by nature. In other words, you can send out ARP updates on any device in the subnet and it will be cached. You don't even have to send a request yourself. It's just going to take the response and say, well, I must have asked for this at some point. So some programs that are used to do ARP spoofing can be found in Linux distributions. Most of the papers I saw were running Kali Linux. So one of the command line tools is called ARP Spoof, very aptly. So what it'll do is you specify the IP address at which you're going to spoof, and then you give it the MAC address that you want to do, and it just sends it over. There's also a bigger tool, a bigger suite of services called ARP. It can do character injection, packet filtering, automated password collection. It can also simulate most internet protocols, so FTP, HTTP, HTTPS, SSH. And it actually has a kill connection. So this is one of the ways that you can get people to switch to your device, is that you can sever the connection between them and the gateway, or aka the router, and then send the ARP spoof saying, oh, by the way, the router is actually me, you can connect to me now. So if you look over there in the little diagram, you can see an ARP table by typing in ARP-A and the link between the IP addresses and the physical addresses. But also notice the type. So the main reason why a man-in-the-middle attack is possible is due to those dynamic types. So in other words, those IP and MAC address bindings are able to change, but if it's got a static binding, it's not changeable. Someone who configured your router made those static, and incoming ARP requests are not going to be able to change those. So back again, this is why I was saying it's really an issue with public Wi-Fi, because if you were on an old network, like a company, they're issuing all the devices. So if they're issuing the devices, they know the MAC addresses. And if they know the MAC addresses that should be connecting to their service, that means that they can make it a static binding and not a dynamic binding, and you have a much more secure communication. But on public Wi-Fi, this is not the case. People come in and out all the time. The number of people that are going through your public Wi-Fi is certainly going to exceed the number of pre-allocated IP addresses on your NAT access point. So it's really this dynamic feature of the access point that is making the man-in-the-middle attack possible. Let's see. So the ARP spoofing procedure. So when the attacker logs on to the public Wi-Fi, aka the subnet, they're going to get the router's IP address. You will scan the network for traffic that you're interested in. Again, if it's HTTP, you can kind of see the whole packet, but if it's HTTPS, you can only really see the headers, but that might just be enough, right? If you're looking for someone that's doing banking, that IP address will be in the header. If you're looking for someone's social media, that'll also be in the header. So what you do is you tell the gateway, you give it a ARP protocol response. You say, hey, by the way, the IP address that I'm targeting, its MAC address is really my MAC address. So if you're getting information from them, send it to me, don't send it to them, because the MAC address has changed. And then what you do is you send an ARP response to the victim, and you say, hey, by the way, even though, because this is an unsafe protocol, the public Wi-Fi, that router, its MAC address just miraculously changed. It's now my MAC address. So if you want to send outgoing information to the internet, send it to me instead. And then finally, this doesn't ensure that forwarding is happening, so you'd have to use a separate program that captures the packets and then forwards them along. And so that way the victim has no idea that you've inserted themselves in the middle. Without forwarding, it'll just see that all of their requests have been dropped by the network. And again, to initiate this attack, you sever their connection with a tool like ARP, and that gives you the time to basically send out your ARP responses, so that when the reconnection happens, then you've successfully inserted yourself as a man in the middle. Now, I did mention that HTTPS has gone a long way to encrypting the traffic, and so the main focus has been shifted towards inserting yourself before HTTPS has been initiated, and this is kind of replacing one communication with two communications. In other words, you're going to set up two TLS connections instead of one. So a lot of times people just will type or click a link and they won't know that it's HTTPS, they'll know that it's HTTP. So when the HTTP request comes to the server, it tries to do the right thing and says, hey, HTTP is not safe, you should use HTTPS instead. So it'll send a 301, 302 resource has moved header, but it'll go to the attacker instead of going to the client. So a TLS connection will happen now between the attacker and the web server. But the attacker is going to basically, what's the word for this again? They're basically just going to modify the TLS connection and just send the HTTP with like lower privilege to the client PC because they requested HTTP, so they have no idea that a TLS connection has actually been formed ahead of them. And in that way, you're able to get access to the encrypted data because the web server doesn't know the difference between the identity of you and the attacker. And so this is known as SSL or TLS stripping, essentially inserting yourself before the TLS connection is going to happen. And the last type of man-in-the-middle attacks that I mentioned was DNS spoofing. This is going to work functionally the same as ARP spoofing, where when you type in a web address, you don't know its IP address, you just have some URL. So your host device is going to have a cache, a DNS cache as opposed to an ARP cache of mappings of URLs to IP addresses. So this is extremely important when it comes to TLS because this is going to be the type of spoofing that is going to be able to fake TLS. So in the previous slide that I showed you, there was only one TLS connection between the attacker and the web server. However, with DNS spoofing, this is actually going to create two TLS connections between the client and the attacker, as well as between the attacker and the server. So when they send out the DNS request, you're going to tell them that the IP address is actually your IP address. This allows you to start doing handshakes, and then you have all of the information necessary to encrypt and decrypt the traffic between the client and the server. Usually what you'll do is you'll actually be hosting a spoofed version of the website itself. So imagine the login page, and that's what's going to allow them to type in their credentials, and then you forward those credentials to the real server. You've got what you've needed, and then you can kill the connection, and they can go ahead and reconnect if they need to the main server. So let's talk about detecting the attacks. In general, all of this extra computation means that a man-in-the-middle attack is going to take a lot more time. So one countermeasure to this would be if ISPs or the local network was able to compare against standard candles. Now this is an idea from astronomy that you have known brightnesses of stars and you're going to use those to compare against other stars, but you would do this with response times. So you have websites that you know people go to frequently, and you could cache standard response times to those networks. So in other words, if a man-in-the-middle attack is being performed, you can compare your response time against the standard candle, aka the standard response time, and that would give you a good idea if someone has inserted themselves in the chain. Now this is good for detecting if someone has created a TLS connection on your behalf, because it's going to take considerably more time, and that variant is known as a key compromise impersonation. Now normal networks just have statistical variance. If you ping a server lots of times, you're never going to get the same number each time. But what we do know is that if you had secure communications and then someone inserted themselves, the average time it will take will go up. So you can perform t-testing or chi-squared testing on the distribution of the time responses you're getting between the servers, and that'll give you some estimation of if someone has inserted themselves, in which case you would terminate the connection and try to pick back up at another time, and or try to refresh your caches so that you're not using the poisoned caches. And one of the ways to detect it I found most interesting was a voting model. It kind of reminded me of, what's the word for it? It's the fancy crypto thing. So Bitcoin is an example of it, but I can't remember the keyword right now. But in other words, you'll basically say, hey, I know I have this ARP address, or I know I have this IP address, or I know I have this MAC address, but what do the other peers in the model think about? So essentially, if yours is different than multiple people's, you know that you've been poisoned, and so you should just update to their value. And you can do the same thing with response times. If your response time to websites happens to be considerably higher than response times that your neighbors are getting, you can assume that you're being listened in on, and that is not good. So to wrap it up, man-in-the-middle attacks compromise CIA on public Wi-Fi. HTTPS and TLS are good encryption, but network protocols expose vulnerabilities before these countermeasures can be established. Attacks introduce delays in the process, and you should kill these if you notice that your times are getting too large. And finally, there's a need to fix how clients and servers discover each other safely. These protocols were discovered before Wi-Fi was really invented, so we need safer protections against these. That's it for my talk. You'll notice I didn't go over really many countermeasures, and I leave that up to the counterpoint presenter.